Hi everyone, this is Grandmaster Eugene Perlstein, and together with Chess.com, I would like to welcome you to my series on the practical chess endgames. So, before I begin showing you some great examples by world famous endgame players such as Capablanca, I want to really make a point to distinguish the two types of endgames from theoretical endgames to practical endgames. So what does that mean? Well, theoretical endgames means that this endgame, you already know the result. So for instance, here we have a simple king and pawn endgame where white has the pawn on the A file, and everybody knows that this is a draw, right? You don't even have to analyze this out if you know what the plan is. So black's plan is to simply walk his king into the corner and just go back and forth until the king is going to get stalemated. And this is really basic stuff. Well, I should also point out that white can add this dark square bishop, let's say on f4. This does not change the evaluation of this endgame. This is still a theoretical endgame because black walks the king into the corner exactly the same way, and this bishop, because it's on the dark square, is not going to help white to win the game. So we can make a few moves just for those of you who are not familiar with this endgame. For instance, a4, king b7, black is simply walking right into the corner, and you're going to see shortly that white cannot make progress. Already the move king b6 is stalemate, and after a6, king a7, you will see that there is simply no way for white to make progress. If bishop e3, king b8, and you will never be able to drive the king away from these two squares. So the outcome is probably going to be stalemate. So king b6, king a8, and bishop f4, this is stalemate. So this is an example of a theoretical endgame. Why is it important for us to learn theoretical endgames? Well, of course, let's say you are down a piece and you notice that if you are able to trade into this type of an endgame, white is up a whole piece and the pawn. It's going to be a draw. So it's really good to know these types of endgames. But the series is not about learning theoretical endgames. There are so many reference books out there. The one that comes to mind is the famous Dvoretsky book, The Endgame Manual, where he talks about all of these various theoretical endgames. But the key is, I feel like, to really master endgame is to learn what I call practical endgames. So let me give you an example of a practical endgame. So one example of a practical endgame is this position that you see in front of you. This endgame is from the game Capablanca Ragozin, and you notice that white is up a pawn. It's very unclear if white is going to be able to convert this pawn right away, or he will need black's help. So let us pause for a moment, and for those of you who really want to figure it out, try to pause the video and ask yourself a question: what's white's winning plan? And I should also give you a couple of pointers how to go about these practical endgames. If you recall, in the opening and in the middle game, you're really under a lot of pressure. You constantly calculate variations, you try to find combinations, tactics, but when it comes to an endgame like this, all of that is off the table. This is called endgame planning. You want to have a general idea, a general scheme that you're trying to go for, as opposed to calculating variations out. So I can give you some practical advice. Let's say you were in a time scramble and you got to an endgame like that. Rather than try to figure out right away, I recommend you to take a break, go for maybe a little walk, get some fruit, just relax. And when you come back to the board, you should have a totally different frame of mind. And the frame of mind, you should be thinking, all right, I have all the time in the world to convert my extra pawn. Black doesn't really have any tactical activity that I have to calculate. So I just have to find the winning plan. So this endgame is actually a great example to try to find that winning plan. Basically, you got to find the setup for your pieces. And Capablanca, who is a world-renowned expert in endgames, right? He was able to break down this endgame in just a few sentences. And I feel like this is extremely, extremely instructive. So number one, white has to stop black from advancing the c pawn to c4. Because if the pawn somehow gets to c5 and c4, it's going to be preventing these guys from moving. So this is number one. So we have to stop this activity, and basically that's why you have to have the rook on the c file. So what's number two? Well, number two is you got to centralize your king. The ideal square for the king is probably this d4 square. So once we centralize the king, we have to improve our pieces. So in Capablanca's vision, he's seeing the rook coming to c3, protecting the a3 pawn. Then he's going to play b4, and then he's going to reroute the knight on a better square on e3. And then he's going to play the move f4. So again, the plan is king on d4, rook on c3, knight on e3, pawn on f4, and pawn on b4. And this is the ideal setup for white. So this is kind of the first stage of his grand plan. The question is, what do you do next? Well, the next stage is you don't have to kind of plan it ahead of time, but the goal is you want to transfer the king over to the queen side and start pushing your pawns. That's it. Simple as that. Notice how he didn't even have to calculate a single variation. So let's see what happens next. So knight d4, so he executes his plan. Rook b7, b4, right? So far so good. Bishop d7. So Rogozin is simply just going back and forth. He's kind of taking a defensive stance. f4, so he's getting ready to march his king. King e7, king f2. So both sides centralize their kings. And I should also point out that centralization of the king is by far one of the most important aspects of majority of endgames. Because in the opening and in the middle game, your king is really a target. Not so in the endgame. In the endgame, the king is not only one of the most important pieces, but it actually helps you to create attacking possibilities.